Thank you. I'll come back to your question at the end. But I'll talk about environmental tax reform to address the major environmental costs of fossil fuel energy. And obviously, the major costs include the carbon emissions, which, along with other gases, are projected to increase global temperatures by 3 to 4 degrees Celsius by 2100, but with scary risks of much more severe warming. Another key problem is that combusting fossil fuels causes local air pollution. It's estimated that that results in over 3 million premature deaths a year. More generally, use of road fuels and motor vehicles is associated with traffic congestion, traffic accidents, road damage, and so on. So I'm going to talk about the case for energy tax reform to address some of these problems, and then provide you with a sense of how far we are at present from the efficient energy prices. By efficient energy prices, I mean prices that cover supply costs and environmental costs. But I'll be taking a global perspective rather than focusing specifically on Italy. So we think that taxes should be center stage in addressing the major environmental costs of energy. We know that these policies are the most effective policies for reducing environmental harms, so long as they're targeted at the right base emissions. So, for example, a tax on carbon emissions, that's going to raise fossil fuel prices, raise prices of electricity and so on, and that's going to provide incentives for shifting to cleaner fuels, promoting energy efficiency across all sectors of the economy with just one single instrument. In addition, environmental taxes can raise substantial revenues, and our recommendation would be that these revenues are used to cut taxes on labor and capital, which distort economic incentives and harm growth. So generally, when we're talking about environmental taxes, we're talking about revenue-neutral tax shifts, taxing energy, fossil fuel energy more, and cutting taxes on labor and capital. We're not talking about raising the overall burden of taxes. And then a third key advantage of environmental taxes is that they can strike the right balance between environmental protection, environmental benefits, and economic costs, so long as we set the tax rates appropriately to reflect environmental damages. So let me just clarify what I mean by the efficient taxation of energy. I mean, for carbon emissions, we have in mind charging fuels equal to their CO2 emissions per unit of fuels times the damage per ton from CO2 emissions. For air pollution as well, we would recommend that we impose charges on fuel use equal to the fuel's air pollution emission rate times the environmental damage per ton of emissions added up over the different air pollutants, the particulates, sulfur dioxide, nitrogen oxide, and so on. The caveat here is that we do want to provide credits for the adoption of emissions control technologies, for example, sulfur dioxide scrubbers at coal plants. Alternatively, if it's administratively feasible, which is probably the case for most advanced countries, we can just charge the emissions as they come directly out of the smokestack rather than imposing an upfront tax on fuel use. And then for the motor vehicle externalities, we would recommend that countries partially transition over the longer term to distance-based or kilometre-based taxes to address these sorts of problems. For example, peak period pricing on busy roads to address traffic congestion. But until these types of policies are comprehensively implemented, we think it's entirely reasonable to reflect the congestion and other environmental costs of vehicle use in road fuel taxes. And we measure these environmental costs. So we actually have a database at the IMF where we've tried to provide some preliminary estimates of the environmental costs by fuel product and by country for over 150 countries. So that's online at our website. We're not doing anything much for global warming here. We just take an illustrative damage value from the literature of $35 per ton. But we did do some very detailed work on air pollution. Here we obtained very detailed country-level estimates of how many people in different countries are exposed to air pollution, and then we match that with data from the World Health Organization on how exposure to air pollution increases various mortality risks, to come up with some sense of the health costs of air pollution from fossil fuels in different countries. Clearly, there's a lot of uncertainty and controversy involved in measuring these environmental costs. So we provide a spreadsheet on our website where you can go in and you can adjust some of the key assumptions that determine environmental costs, make different assumptions, and see how that affects the estimates of environmental costs and appropriate taxes on fuel use. So to gauge how far we are at present from efficient energy prices, we've been measuring energy subsidies, but using a broad definition of energy subsidies that captures not only undercharging for supply costs, which is what the traditional focus has been on, but also undercharging for environmental costs. Because what matters is how far are energy prices at present relative to prices that we need to reflect both supply and environmental costs. And our estimate of global energy subsidies for 2015 is actually quite large at $5.3 trillion. That's 6.5% of global GDP. 24% of this big subsidy is coming from failure to charge for the global warming emissions. 6% is coming from failure to fully charge for supply costs. That's mainly a problem for Middle East and North Africa countries where domestic energy prices are held down below the world prices of for petroleum and natural gas. But the biggest component is actually the local air pollution damages, the failure to charge for the air pollution damages, the human health damages when coal and diesel and other polluting fuels are used. Undercharging for motor vehicle externalities, traffic congestion and so on accounts for 12% of the subsidy. So a lot of countries are already reflecting those costs in high fuel taxes, but this is aggregating over other countries where current fuel taxes are below levels that would be warranted to reflect the costs of air pollution, traffic congestion, accidents and so on. And then the final component there is the foregone revenue to the extent that countries are not fully applying general consumer taxes, value-added taxes, to fossil fuels. That's 6% of the subsidy. Broken down by fuel type, coal accounts for the huge portion of this energy subsidy, 59%. Petroleum accounts for 28%, natural gas 10%, and subsidies for electricity consumption 3%. So we think it's ironic that coal, which is the dirtiest fuel from both a carbon and a local air pollution perspective, has rarely been taxed in any country. Energy subsidies are pervasive both across regions and across countries. The energy subsidies are at least 2% of GDP for the regional averages. They go all the way up to over 8% of GDP in former Soviet Union countries and in Asia. And in absolute terms, China is the biggest subsidizer at 2.3 trillion. So that's just reflecting that China has a lot of coal use and a lot of population exposure. It's very densely populated, so there's a lot of population exposure to the air pollution emissions from coal use. So there's a lot of people dying prematurely from air pollution exposure in China. So that's why there's such a big implicit subsidy there. United States is second with 0.7 trillion. That's partially reflecting that road fuel taxes in the US are relatively low, insufficient to reflect the full costs of the environmental costs of vehicles, and also there's still some significant health damages and carbon damages from coal use in the United States. The EU as a whole, we estimate the subsidy at 0.3 trillion, and for Russia and India, again 0.3 trillion, and then Japan 0.2 trillion. So if we were to reform energy prices, that is, move from current energy prices towards prices that would fully reflect supply costs and environmental costs, we estimate that there would be a very substantial health benefit. At a global level, there would be a 57% reduction in premature deaths from air pollution. We also estimate that there'd be a substantial reduction in carbon emissions at a global level. If countries were to get energy prices right, we estimate that CO2 reductions would fall by a very substantial 24%. Disproportionately large there in the Middle East and North Africa, because those countries have a lot of subsidies for fossil fuels. So if those were removed, and on top of that, taxes were imposed to reflect environmental costs, you'd get big reductions in fuel use in that region. And emerging and developing Asia, China and so on, there's a lot of coal use. So again, charging for the full environmental costs of our coal would have a disproportionately large impact on reducing fuel use and emissions in that region. And there would be a very substantial fiscal dividend from energy price reform. The revenue gains are going to be less than our measure of energy subsidies, because as we increase energy prices, energy consumption falls, and hence the tax base is eroded somewhat. But still, at a global level, we estimate that energy price reform would yield revenues of about 4% of GDP. And the revenues would be particularly large as a percent of GDP in emerging market economies like China. Revenues could be as high as 7% of GDP there. And just to put this into perspective, for developing countries, the yellow triangle there is indicating revenues from corporate income taxes in those countries at present. So for developing countries, there's more at stake in terms of revenue from energy price reform than from what these countries collect from the corporate income tax. And the blue square there, that's what these countries spend on average on public health. So again, there's more revenue to be obtained from energy price reform in developed countries than what these countries are spending on public health at present. So just to conclude, I mean, we think that environmental taxes are a better way to address the environmental costs of energy use than regulatory approaches. I mean, clearly regulatory approaches are better than nothing, but they're less effective than environmental taxes. It's just difficult to replicate all of the behavioral responses for reducing emissions that you get with emissions pricing. And you can't, for example, regulate that people drive their vehicles less or economize on the use of air conditioners and heating and so on, whereas that's all automatic under energy pricing, where you provide incentives for these behavioral responses. And regulatory approaches, I mean, they have to, by definition, involve a wide range of different programs to improve energy efficiency, promote renewables, and so on across different sectors. So administratively, it's just more complicated. And from our perspective, a drawback of regulation is that it doesn't raise any revenues for broader fiscal reform. And we even think that, we think emissions trading systems are fine, but we think taxes would be a better approach because taxes provide more certainty over future emissions prices, which is important to promote investments in low emissions technologies. And environmental taxes automatically provide an important source of revenue to national treasuries, whereas it's a bit more convoluted under trading systems. For trading systems to be part of a broader fiscal reform, as we would recommend, the allowances have to be auctioned with the revenues then transferred from the Environment Agency to the Finance Ministry. And then yet another issue with trading systems is that they've been imposed downstream on industrial sources, so they haven't captured the small-scale emissions sources from heating fuels and road fuels and so on. Whereas if countries were moving ahead with a carbon tax, we'd recommend that's imposed upstream on fuel supply, so you cover all petroleum products, coal and natural gas, and it's much more comprehensive. We also think that environmental tax reform is largely in countries' own domestic interests because most of the benefits are domestic. A lot of the benefits are domestic environmental benefits, for example, from improved health due to a cleaner air, Some of them are fiscal benefits. About a quarter, as we saw on the earlier chart, is the benefits from global warming, but 3/4 are domestic benefits. So we think that countries can move ahead unilaterally with energy price reform, make themselves better off. They don't need to wait for other countries to act. And in addition, energy pricing reform is clearly going to help a lot with the emissions mitigation pledges that countries are making for COP21 in Paris. And then finally, our main audience is obviously finance ministers rather than environment ministers, and we think that finance ministers have a key role to play in working with environment ministers. First of all, to promote the use of environmental taxes. Secondly, to help administer environmental taxes. And a lot of these taxes are just a straightforward extension of what finance ministers are already doing. They're already administering road fuel excises. And so, for example, to impose a comprehensive carbon charge, you would build carbon charges into the road fuel excises and then extend similar charges to the supply of other fuels. And then thirdly, finance ministers are important because it's important that we use the potential revenues from environmental taxes productively, preferably for other tax reductions. And we think that it's especially important now to make sure those fiscal opportunities are exploited given historically high debt to GDP ratios and future fiscal pressures from aging populations. You don't want to waste a potentially valuable source of revenue. So just coming back to your question, I think that was on how do we move forward with carbon pricing issues. Is that?
The change in international pricing about carbon.
Yeah. Sorry,
if something will move or not.
Yeah, I mean, clearly there are a lot of obstacles that we need to overcome. I mean, at present, as was mentioned, we do have a lot of carbon pricing schemes, and about 40 carbon pricing schemes at the national level, counting the EU system as 28, and then over 20 subnational schemes, but they're only covering about 12% of global emissions, and typically with prices that are well below $10 a ton, so much less than is needed for environmental purposes. So we need to transition to much greater coverage of emissions pricing and to greater prices.
More international, perhaps.
Yeah. So at an international level, we think that once countries have started moving on carbon pricing and energy pricing reform in response to their emissions mitigation pledges for Paris, once countries have those policies in place, we think that it makes sense for them to think about coordination through carbon pricing floors. So a coalition of major emitting countries would agree on a minimum floor price, and that allows countries the flexibility to set higher prices if they wish to for domestic fiscal reasons or domestic environmental reasons. We don't want to hold up countries where aggressive carbon pricing is politically easier than it is in other countries. And that's the way, for us, that's a natural way to deal with these under-taxation from an international perspective. That's the way we've dealt with tax competition issues, for example, in the European Union with tax floors for value-added taxes and excises on alcohol and energy products. So to us, that would be a natural way to go. One issue there is that countries may adjust their broader fiscal provisions for energy, adjust broader energy taxes or energy subsidies, which may enhance or undermine the impact of a carbon tax floor. So we'd have to take account of those when we're monitoring effective carbon prices, but we think that's all manageable. Okay.
Thank you.